Now let's go over the interface for MightyBake, and I'll just kind of describe what everything does in there. I'm going to switch this back to nothing. You got the basic file menu here. The main thing that's important in here is the workflow tab where you install the Maya shelf. So you just click Maya, install shelf, close Maya before you do this, pick the version that you want, yes, to 2015 because that's the one that I use. You'll see the revision number here, the software number. This is actually really helpful so you can tell if you're on the latest version. So as new features get added, which they do frequently, like it seems like multiple features get added almost every month, you can make sure that you have the latest version by checking the version number up here and then going to the website and seeing what feature release you care about and what version of the software it's in. I recommend always getting the latest version. There's just tons of bug fixes and stuff go in. Every time someone finds a bug on polycount, it's fixed like really fast. So we already talked about the processor stuff. I don't know what this GPU beta stuff does. I've tried it and it like just crashes or like is way slower. So I would say never turn that on. Just always set the processors to be the highest number that you can. The presets tab that we already talked about, that populates settings through the interface, and you can save those presets, which is super helpful. And to create a new preset, you just click this plus button here. So we can create a preset. We'll call it, whatever, video tutorial. And there you go. You've got the video tutorial. And right now it has nothing in it. So whatever settings I change here will be saved to that tutorial. The cool thing to know about the MightyBake interface is there's no apply button. There's no save or anything. As you type stuff, it just magically is saving it with like pretty much every keystroke. So I can just put a bunch of junk in there. I'll close MightyBake down. We'll reload it. I haven't hit apply or enter or anything, and it just saves it, which is super nice. It's awesome because if MightyBake crashes, you don't lose any work that you were doing because it saves like kind of on almost on a per click or a per character enter. So this tab here is the high poly tab. This is where you browse for your high poly meshes. You just click browse and grab your high poly there. You can click the plus symbol for multiple high polys. So if you find like maybe you're working on some crazy ZBrush file and the high polys are just, it's too painful to like have those all in one file, you could actually break up a model into multiple high reses and just browse them all here. The tick boxes on the left of the interface are whether or not to include the map or include the model or include the map or include the whatever the feature. So if you have some temporary meshes that you still want to leave them here, but you just want to turn them off for debugging or something, then you can just turn off the tick box. To get rid of parts of the interface that you don't need anymore, like you're like, oh, I wanted to add a high poly and then fuck that, I don't need it anymore. You can just click the minus button, and that like deletes that part of the interface or whatever. So you browse for your high poly there. You browse for your envelope there. It's just the low poly cage or whatever that you create in Maya. Same thing. You can say use or don't use the envelope, which is helpful for debugging. So you can test it with and without the envelope, make sure everything's working as expected. I generally bake without envelopes to start because a lot of the bakes that I do, they don't have a ton of convex shapes to them. So I'll start without an envelope, and then if I see projection overlap, then I'll add an envelope in. It's just faster, it requires less work. Low poly shape, same thing. Browse for this. Grab whatever your low poly model is. You cannot do multiple low polys. It only supports one file, but generally that's fine because the low poly models are pretty simple. You should 100% use the Maya shelf to export your low poly. It's kind of a must. If you don't, you will get shading errors. There's kind of no way around it. There's some magical code in the Maya low poly export button that like makes the software work. I have no idea how it works, but it's awesome. For the envelope and the high poly, so I know for the high poly, it does not matter so much where you export the high poly from. It can take OBJ files directly out of ZBrush, and it can take FBX files directly out of Mudbox. It can take FBX files out of Maya. I think it can kind of take, whatever. It doesn't really matter for the high poly so much because you're baking that information down to the low poly. The low poly matters. I think it's the same for the envelope, but the envelopes are always so simple. I've never tried any other software, but I have tried multiple different exports. So you don't necessarily need to use the high button in Maya to export the high poly meshes, and I don't think you do for the envelope either, but you absolutely have to for the low, or your maps won't come out correct. And then down here in the maps section, this is where you choose what type of maps you want. So here it's just like defaulted to normal map, and then here under tangents, this is where you pick your target render engine. So there's a bunch of stuff in there right now. So typically I'm baking a Maya viewport map for previewing, and then for my final map, when I import it into Unreal, I'll do Unreal 4.7. And so someone was asking on the forum, this is a good question to bring up, is like Unreal 4.7 converted their tangent space over to MIK, M-I-K-K, to better support XNormal bakes, as far as I know. And in the newest version of MightyBake, you've got FBX tangents, Maya, Viewport 2.0, Unreal 3, Unreal 4, Dota, Unreal 4.7, and then MIK. It's like, well, fuck, which one do I use? There's so many there. So the answer for people wanting to see their map correctly baked in Unreal 4 without flipping the green channel is Unreal 4.7 with this set to minus. I think it's the default. Let's just make sure. Minus. Yeah, I think it's minus is what it defaults to. But if you're a Maya guy, you probably want Y up. So I think you set that to like plus or whatever. I can't remember if it's plus or minus, but you just flip it. It's set to export into Unreal just natively, which is not part of our pipeline because we're all Maya based and we do a lot of compositing in Photoshop. So in Unreal we use the flip green channel tick box. So we don't actually want our maps like baked out to work directly in Unreal. We want them to baked out to work directly in Maya. If you're Maya, you just export that, obviously. And that's what the MIK, M-I-K-K option does. It's basically exactly the same as Unreal 4.7. It's just it automatically flips the Y for you. So, technically speaking, if you're a Maya user and you're flipping the green channel in Unreal, then you can just use MIK and it'll just work. If you are maybe a Max user and you are not flipping the green channel anywhere, you could use Unreal 4.7 by default. If you're a Maya user and you wanted to flip the green channel in Unreal, you could use Unreal 4.7 and flip this so it bakes out with Y up instead of the other way around. Let's just set it to Maya. Sampling is just the anti-aliasing, so you've got up to 8 times. I typically find for production bakes 4x4 is fine. This will obviously slow down your bake, so I do preview bakes at 1x1, which is no anti-aliasing. I think, I can't remember now, but I think it'll bake a 4K map in like 6 seconds at 1x1. And then obviously it'll slow down a little bit at 4x4, but it's still super fast. We'll bake a map in the next part of the tutorial. Blur, if you're familiar with Maya's Baker, this is just a Gaussian blur. It's a post-process, so it just takes your image at the end of the day and runs a Gaussian blur filter on it. This is just like the number of pixels it blurs. So if you wanted to bake like a map that you were used to, a production quality map that you were used to baking in Maya, you would do normal map, Maya viewport, sampling 4x4, Gauss pixel blur of 3, and then Y up, and then bake it. In this drop down here, this is actually the map type. So you can also bake an AO map, material ID, displacement, height map, vertex colors, and you'll see these settings change based on what type of map it is, which is really nice. So like each map has its own kind of settings related to the map type. So for AO, you get quality from low to ultra. For production quality settings, like Probably high is good for most stuff. Depends on what kind of resolution of map you're baking. Ultra is obviously the slowest, although still substantially faster than baking like Ultra and X normal. And then spread is kind of how much AO spreads out from the cracks, I guess. So really 160 is the default. I would typically leave it at that. Lowering it will cause AO to get tighter just into the cracks. Like it'll almost turn into a cavity map if you set it to like 10 or 50 or something like that. And then distance is the distance at which objects will contribute to the occlusion. So if you set it to 0, setting anything to 0 or most things in MightyBake to 0 means infinite, or for the distance anyways. So I would always just leave this at infinite. I would never really mess around with this, because if something is occluding that you don't want it to occlude, you could always use an envelope, or you could use the search distance to like get rid of that stuff. But I mean, you can play around with the setting. If you set it to low, you can pretty much like bake maps and test them all day without wanting to kill yourself, because it's pretty fast. Material ID, same thing. This is sampling 4x4. This is a really neat feature that someone requested on the forum. It bakes out the material ID into separate layers, and if you choose PNG, it'll bake it out with the alpha channel embedded into it. So basically you'll get all of your ID maps kind of pre-separated, and you can just drag them into Photoshop one at a time. So you don't have to mask anything out. You don't have to like apply a layer mask or like select the color and delete the background. You get them as individual layers as is. So that's actually really awesome. Displacement map, not too much there. Same stuff. Height map, same thing. Vertex colors, same thing. The vertex colors are supported from OBJs coming out of ZBrush, and they're supported directly out of vertex colors applied in Maya to the high poly. One thing to discuss about height maps and displacement maps is the displacement map uses the full range from 0 to 1 in the grayscale gradation, no matter how high your object is in the scene. And the height map uses a world space coordinate, so you actually have to kind of dial in like the search distance, and that's kind of how much it bakes out. So I think for most people, myself, I use the displacement map because I don't have to really think about anything. It just gives me a 0 to 1 range gradient from black to white for the high parts, or I guess from black to white. And if you work with the height map, it's kind of more work. You have to go into your scene and actually measure it and find out how tall your object is to get the correct gradient. And then here, I'll just set this back to normal. And then the really cool thing about this section is you can hit the plus symbol and add more maps. So you can be like, I want to bake a normal map with these settings, and I want to bake an AO map with these settings, and I also want material ID. And you just click bake, and it'll bake out those maps in succession. And then you can leave all the settings in here, and if you just want to rebake the normal map, you can leave the settings, but you can untick these, and it'll just bake this, which is super cool. And then as well, you might want to actually bake out multiple normal maps at the same time. Maybe you're like, I want to see the Maya viewport, and I want to also see, I want to get the Unreal as well. So at the same time, because I want to preview them at the same time for whatever reason, you can actually just have multiple normal maps, and you can choose the tangent space, which is super cool. So you could go like, I want the MIC tangent space at whatever settings, and I want the Maya viewport at these settings. So let's say I'm previewing in Maya with super fast settings in YUp, and I'm gonna do my Unreal bake with final quality settings, let's say, and then like you can just leave that there and turn that off and be like baking in Maya, baking in Maya, baking in Maya, and then cool, I'm gonna do my Unreal now, and just click rebake or whatever. Or if you want to see them both at the same time, then just go for it, just bake them all at once. So that's the map sections. The output setting, this is where you name your file. So you browse or whatever to the folder, and then you just give it a name, you know, like video tutorial, and it will append this name to all the map types, and it'll use its MightyBake's own internal naming convention. So like when you export a normal map MICT, it'll be like tangent space normal map video tutorial, or video tutorial tangent space normal map MIKK and Maya or whatever. So it'll organize them all in the folder, so you're not overwriting files by mistake. Like when you're baking normal map 1, it'll show you the object space, the tangent space, and denote that it's a Maya map. Width height is self-explanatory. That's the size of your map. Dilation is sometimes referred to as edge padding. I think dilation is the programmer term for edge padding. That's just how many, it's in pixels. So you set this to 16 or higher if you want your maps to have edge padding. Set it to 0 if you want none. The format is TIFF 16-bit by default. You've got 8-bit formats in there as well. You have EXR, although I've baked a map in there and I don't really know what to do with them when they're in EXR mode because the colors are kind of different, I think, but someone requested it, so it's in there. And if you do PNG, 16-bit or 8-bit, PNG will bake the alpha channel into it. So if you have like areas of transparency in your map, it'll already be pre-masked out for you. So like when I bake a material ID, I'll turn on layers. Don't want any anti-aliasing. I'll do material ID with layers and 16-bit, and that'll give me a bunch of like transparencies basically for the layer, so I don't have to do any extra work in Photoshop. I just have to drag them in and they're already done perfectly for me, masked out and everything. And then search distance set to 0 is infinite. Search distance is the distance it's going to shoot rays out from the low poly surface to look for the high poly surface. So I would leave this to be infinite unless you have geometry that has like some convex shapes with overlaps and stuff like that. Then you can try reducing this number to try and occlude those models, or you can just add an envelope and set it to be infinite. One thing to know about the search distance plus the envelope is that the envelope doesn't override the search distance. They're used in conjunction. So if you're using an envelope, you should pretty much always set this to 0 to be infinite, because if you set it to 5, you set it to 5, let's say, and your envelope is at 10, it'll still stop at 5. It won't even touch your envelope before it stops. And then this is in centimeters for Maya. So it's like 5 centimeters is tiny if you're working in meters, for example. So it's relative to Maya's kind of scale system. So it doesn't really matter though, just always set it to infinite. And if you're getting bake overlap errors, I would say just make a quick envelope and export that and rebake it. Geometry normals and surface normals we already talked about. Those are just the different bake methods. This one allows you to bake across hard edges or smoothing group breaks, but causes more distortion. This one gives you no distortion, but doesn't creates like a weird kind of cracking effect or double beveled edge across hard edges in your low poly, or sorry, in your normals in your low poly. And then search method, farthest is what I use. So the difference between, you got farthest and you've got closest. The difference between farthest and closest is closest shoots out a ray and returns the first point it finds on the surface, whereas farthest shoots out a ray and returns the farthest point it finds on a surface. So farthest is going to be more accurate, and if you're working with exploded models with envelopes, this is the one that you want. This will create a predictive result. That's probably the one most people are going to use a lot of the time. And closest will create like a more unpredictable result where you're not really, it's just going to grab the closest point on surface and return that into the bake. But there was someone on the PolyCamp forum that wanted to bake their weapon model, but they didn't want to explode it. So they had a bunch of really tightly placed clipping geometry, overlapping geometry that was all kind of clipping into one another. And they wanted to bake AO for it, almost like a kind of like a low to low AO style, like a more like a light map almost, where they didn't care that the AO was 100% black where the pieces intersected. They just wanted to get like an awesome AO bake from it. So if you set it to closest, it'll give you a much cleaner result there. Whereas farthest, because the pieces are all overlapping and the model wasn't exploded, it'll give you all this like other pieces being baked onto other pieces. So again, like, depends on what your workflow is. Try them both or whatever. I would say farthest is the one that most people are going to want. Bake obviously bakes the map. Just click it. Oh, actually, I can't click it because I don't have anything in this one. We'll go back to just my test object. Farthest. Click it. It opens up this window and bakes it. It tells you the time it bakes and everything, what it's doing. And then you can tick this box here if you want to. So next time you bake, it'll automatically do the bake and close the window and take you back to the main interface. Untick it. It'll just stay on this until you click close. And then finally, this is probably one of my favorite features of the software. Click this button and it opens the folder that you've baked to, which is awesome. I wish that they had this button in every piece of software that saves files. This is surprisingly like something really simple, but it just saves so much time. Just being able to like, where did that file go again? Okay, whatever. Just click it, and boom, you're there. You're in the folder looking at the stuff. And then actually, while we're in here, you can kind of see some of the naming convention that we talked about. So like, here's the it's called call and test. Whatever, we're testing something, and TNM for tangent space map, and then Maya, and then TIFF, and then same thing, tangent space map UE47 TIFF, and then there's same thing here is this will be the object space map, so it's denoted with ONM object normal map, I guess, and that's it for the MightyBake interface.